What fruit do we need to grow that you would like?
What fruit could we grow that we don't already grow?
Yeah, I think you have everything.
She likes mangoes, but we can't grow those. Avocados, can't grow them either.
As Americans, we're used to having year-round access to just about anything, from tomatoes and strawberries to avocados. But not everything can grow here, and that comes at a cost.
We're next to one of the biggest cities in the world, and that's where the crops should be grown. You know, they shouldn't be coming from the other side of the states or from over the ocean in a container that's sitting around and stuff. It should be, you know, direct to the market.
The number of farms and what they produce for human consumption have been on a steady decline over the past few decades in the US. Instead, what's being grown is corn and soybeans, used for livestock feed and ethanol, or as cheap sugars, starches, and oils in highly processed foods.
In the US, we have nearly 1 billion acres of farmland. We have a population of just 330 million people. Yet we're not feeding ourselves. We are wrongly focused on growing and exporting these low-value crops that are not feeding us. And then we're counting on other countries to supply us with the high-value, healthy food crops that we rely on.
These staple commodities, what soybeans and corn are called, have a special status, which grants them more federal aid. They fetch top dollars being exported overseas, and they're cheaper and less risky to produce.
At the end of the day, farmers have to make the decision of what to do with the land that they have, and they have to make a decision in terms of what they think is best for their family operation.
So why isn't the US prioritizing more of what its population needs to eat? And what can it do to change that?
It's a chipper apple. It's proprietary to Locust Grove. Most handsome apple we have. Being it's named after me.
Chip Kent is a sixth-generation Locust Grove fruit farmer in Milton, New York, in the Hudson Valley. This is his son Sawyer, a seventh-generation farmer. Like most US farms, Locust Grove is family-operated.
24, they planted the vineyard down here and this one, and then the quince orchard.
The more than 200-year-old farm grows an average of 800,000 pounds of mainly apples per year. Though Locust Grove did not share their annual income, New York State farms bring in an average of $80,000 per year after all expenses are accounted for, something called net farm income. The farm also operates a brewery and a U-pick orchard in the fall. Locust has slowly expanded from 60 acres to 100 by acquiring other, smaller farms in the area. Farms of Locust Grove's size only represent 28% of total US farms. The largest 2% control 42% of all acres. New York State saw its sharpest drop in number of farms and acreage in decades between 2017 and 2022. Net farm income is forecast to plunge nearly 40% in 2024 from 2022's record high. That's mainly due to rising production costs and a drop in crop prices. Specialty crop farmers, like fruits, vegetables, and legumes, record higher incomes on average, but they're high risk, high reward because they're volatile and don't get even close to as much government assistance as commodities. To remain in business, Locust has had to get very efficient with its crop, diversify, and expand.
We plant a lot of different things, so we can get away with, you know, something failing. We've created more with the brewery here and adding the pick your owns, and if you stop and you lose interest or you get a little lazy, then that'll end. And then that's when the farm either gets sold to somebody else as a farm or it goes off to have houses on it. We could put up some really nice houses overlooking the river here. So it's like 2012, we added Woody's, our neighbors, Ed Wood, their farm. It was 21 acres on the north side. And it wasn't but a couple of years after that we added Tabasco's.
Locust Grove's main source of revenue is selling at New York City farmers markets 4 times a week. Some fruit is also sold to winemakers. Everything else is used by the brewery.
Biggest stone fruit crop we've ever had.
Yeah,
Just
we had none the year before.
Plum, well, we had no plums the year before. We had a lot of peaches and a lot of cherries.
Operation.
So they've already covered a number of things here so far. One of the big points that they made early on was that basically U.S. spends so much of their effort and agricultural land on making commodity products, basically like soy and corn, in order to basically be shipped abroad. And those aren't necessarily exactly what Americans eat. And so we import a lot of what is actually eaten in America from a variety of places. They've also kind of highlighted the fact that there's a small percentage of farms that have a very large percentage of land, and that isn't particularly surprising to me. They also seem to be kind of referencing the smaller farm to it. But the reason why that's not surprising to me is because that happens in almost every business. Like if you think of a small business, there's going to be a very small footprint. There's going to be very few people in it. And they're eventually going to potentially grow into larger and larger formats. And then as they grow, they're going to have probably more efficiency in how they're operating and what they're doing. They even took this kind of smaller farm as an example of what could be done and just use this as a counterexample. This smaller farm is actually optimizing its efficiency as a farm, and it also has grown the land and what it is doing. And so, presumably, while this farm is being used as an example today as a smaller footprint and a smaller farm, if you fast forward 10, 20, 30 years, maybe this could be a farm, if they keep going on the trend, that moves up kind of those segments into a smaller ownership, but a lot more acreage. And so that isn't, again, surprising for that reason, which is that's how most classic businesses happen. You have larger operations, you grow, you optimize, and you continue over time until you get bigger and bigger, and then you get more and more successful. And so that could just be the distinction between a farm that has been long standing and been doing this for a number of decades versus somebody who's newer. And so that in and of itself isn't particularly concerning to me. I think that is a natural process that we see in capitalism. I think another example would be like the rich get richer, which is like the people who already figured out how to get money or have money can then leverage that to find and get more, and potentially even use the tricks and methods that they did previously to keep doing it. And so this is where that's a natural process that happens in a variety of areas. So that's not particularly surprising to me, though they do appear to be covering prices. So we'll see what happens. I know prices definitely shot up due to inflation and COVID. It did seem like they were saying that there's projected decrease. So maybe that's due to like supply chain not being as problematic. So we'll see what they have to say on the pricing of goods. And this one is actually inflation adjusted. So that's something to keep in mind, which is they're trying to keep the actual price kind of consistent year over year. So this isn't just pure sticker price.
Additional expenses are continuously rising. Some affect specialty crops more than others. Fruit and vegetables are delicate, highly perishable, and labor-intensive. Farm labor costs are expected to increase 6.9% in 2024.
60% of what we bring in right now is just labor. The margins on what we had have gotten smaller. Back in the 80s, you made a little bit less, but you could put it in the bank at 10%. So, and you didn't need a lot.
Competition is another thing that is making it increasingly harder for American farmers to survive. When the North American Free Trade Agreement passed in 1994, it lowered prices by expanding produce variety and availability in American grocery stores. But it hurt smaller American farms. And in recent years, lower crop returns and higher production costs have made U.S. produce more expensive as farmers have had to pass off the increase in costs to consumers. As for Locust Grove, the Kents say they won't switch to more profitable crops like soybeans. For one, they're just not suited for the region's climate. The Kents are also unlikely to sell, no matter how much land prices may increase.
We just need money. Maybe cut back on some of our taxes, reduce our fuel costs, our chemical costs. I mean, that's what's eating us alive. We don't want to be multi-millionaires, but we also don't want to have to work our fingers to the bone and not make any money.
So something that's interesting here as well, which is, again, they seem to be using this farm kind of as like this anecdotal example of like what farming should be like. But they even kind of offhandedly quickly covered the fact that this farmer has considered making commodity goods here because they could have a better margin, but chose not to due to the climate in which he is located. So this is an interesting scenario where like even this individual presumably would have preferred to farm corn and or soybeans in order to get higher margins. But due to the region he's in, that was prohibitive for him. So again, this is an interesting example that they chose to use in so much as like it seems to be potentially exemplifying why the problem exists, but they're also using it sort of as an example of like how they think farming should be done. So there almost seems to have this duality to this example where there's the pros and the cons for the case that they're making.
Or go backwards.
One of the most complex yet influential pieces of U.S. legislation is the Farm Bill. It's been passed about every 5 years since 1933 and impacts everything from what we eat to how farmers make a living. A big part of it funds programs like SNAP, which help low-income Americans buy food. The last one passed in 2018 for $428 billion. More than $30 billion went to large farms growing commodities in the form of payments called subsidies. They help farmers deal with lower harvests, price swings, and natural disasters. Over the years, federal crop insurance programs have increasingly favored row crops, which include corn, wheat, soybeans, and sugarcane.
That's always something that comes up is, the largest farms getting the most amount of subsidy payments, and can that be more equally distributed? I think, the tricky part there is there's a lot of what I consider to be small family farms, which I'm a part of. We're not a huge farm. We're an average size farm in the middle of North Dakota. It's a third generation family farm started by my grandfather. I farm now with my dad and my brother, and there are financial limitations.
The USDA funds other programs that support specialty crop farmers in part, like partnering with local and regional producers to buy produce for food banks and school meals.
We go into the marketplace and we purchase food for a wide variety of purposes, and most often those foods are fruit and vegetable production. If you look at the totality of what's being done here, I think you'll see that there's a significant investment that we've made in specialty crop production.
For more than 2 decades, the largest and wealthiest farms receive the most aid, raking in nearly 80% of total subsidies. Gacko's farm is about 5,500 acres.
There are some of those limitations in place and some adjustment there to more accurately reflect the size of farms and who should be receiving that type of financial assistance. But, if you go too far in doing that, it would affect a farm of my size as well.
The U.S. has been a leader in corn and soybean production since the 90s.
All of this really is to benefit a handful of corporations that profit off of those policies, those exports.
The 1996 Farm Bill removed certain growing requirements, which encouraged farmers to plant crops based on market demand rather than government regulations. Today, the United States dominates in commodity production, specifically meat. There are top agriculture exports, valued at more than $64 billion in 2023. Corn and soybeans alone accounted for more than half of all total farm crop income that year. So why corn and soybeans? They play an important role in a few industries. For one, global meat consumption continues to grow, and that livestock needs to eat. Corn and soybeans are used in processed foods, which make up over half of Americans' diets. And lastly, they're ingredients in biofuel production, which makes them invaluable.
These same agriculture policies that are driving our trade deficit are driving poor health. Subsidies are a major driver of Americans' diets. The foods that the government subsidizes, those are the foods that are going to be more readily available and more affordable to our citizens.
Yes, that's an interesting point that they're making as well, which is at first they kind of highlighted those crops as things that basically we don't use as food, but then here they're kind of backtracking a little bit into how corn and soy actually ends up being used in feeding livestock, which is a growing food source for Americans, and also processed foods. Obviously, I wouldn't encourage folks to have more processed foods than fresh fruits and vegetables. So I do think what they're highlighting still does make sense, where potentially we should be subsidizing more foods that we believe are healthy for Americans, and then therefore we can kind of push this. Because again, as they're highlighting, like processed foods, the types of processed foods that we have are usually so cheap because that's where they're subsidized, that's what we farm the most, and so that's what we have. And there's a potential shift that could occur if we subsidize foods and fruits and vegetables of various types that are healthier for the average American to consume. And then that might trickle down into there being more and more options of this available to individuals. And then they would start consuming those types of food more, which could be healthy. I think an example of this in my mind would be like dairy, for instance, which is dairy is a pretty highly subsidized area in America. And dairy is everywhere here, certainly much more prominently than it is in other countries, from like milk to cheese, etc. We consume quite a bit of it. And the government actually helps push this through that subsidization. And they've also used it for a variety of other purposes. And so that's where it's subsidized, it's cheap, it's readily available. So it's what a lot of Americans eat. And so this is kind of where you put your money for food and what's being grown could end up actually in the hands and mouths of Americans. And so it is still an interesting idea, and that could still be beneficial to reconsider where we emphasize our subsidies, but just want to kind of call out the fact that they are still technically highlighting here that actually some of this food, some of these crops are actually being used in food for Americans.
Here in rural America, the economies for our small towns, our small communities, our small businesses, a lot of that depends on, farmers continuing to be able to be profitable and invest back in their farms and invest back in their communities.
Health experts have linked our high commodity consumption with the country's growing obesity rate. Fruit and vegetable production is on a decline. And despite an increase in availability due to a large rise in imports, less than 20% of U.S. adults eat enough fruits and vegetables. But Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack sees things differently.
We've seen a significant increase in consumption and actually in production of specialty crops across the United States. We import because we like to have choice 12 months out of the year. But in terms of actually feeding ourselves, our ranchers, our farmers, our producers are extraordinarily productive, and they provide everything that we need in this country, and that's an advantage we have over many, many other nations.
The 2018 Farm Bill expired in September 2024. Congress has been unable to pass a new bill, putting funding for some programs in jeopardy and hurting farmers faced with increased competition and rising fuel and fertilizer costs.
Agriculture is in serious condition. Input costs have risen dramatically, while the price they receive for what they grow has diminished. The issue here is the Farm Bill.
A big sticking point are reference prices. Those are the minimum prices set by Congress for commodities like corn, soybeans, and wheat. Payments are triggered when prices fall below the set number.
It's easier for Congress to give more money to defense than it is the Department of Agriculture.
Disagreements over these subsidies and who gets them continue to anger activists and farmers alike, especially those who grow specialty crops. The requirements can be tough to meet and hard to prove. The Kents, for example, have only ever received $500.
We have to put our neck on the line, and then we have to prove we have a loss, and the premium's outrageous. They do help offset some costs, but they don't come close to paying, a serious bill. We could use a little help. Who's gonna grow our food? You really wanna buy it all from overseas?
On the other hand, pulling subsidy funding for commodities could be devastating for those producers. The American Soybean Association recommends seeking funding elsewhere. If lawmakers don't pass a new farm bill before January 2025, a whole new set of lawmakers will have to debate it.
I don't think people are excited about the possibility of starting all over again. The new administration is going to have to get its sea legs, if you will, and that's going to take time. So you're looking at an extension of the existing bill.
And they could make big changes. Commodity prices could also remain low for the next few years.
Not having one in place right now hasn't ended those programs, but it does create uncertainty moving forward into 2025 and beyond. Farmers already are making plans for 2025, have already made purchasing decisions on inputs. The margins are really tight.
My father always said, here you have a whole lot of promises out there. Every single bloom is a promise. We promise that we're gonna have fruit, but you never know, because promises are broken.
Advocates are pushing for a more equal distribution of federal resources and additional support to other crops. Many point to Mexico, which is the largest fruit and vegetable exporter to the U.S. The country subsidizes much of its agriculture costs and barriers to entry. Its agriculture imports to the U.S. nearly quadrupled between the years 2000 and 2023.
It goes to show you that if the government supports it, farmers are going to grow it. Because our farmers They know how to grow and raise enough food to feed us, but these backwards policies are standing in the way, and farmers are moving into that direction because that's where the support is.
Mexico's major advantages are cheap labor and land availability. The US has neither, but the government could mandate that some commodity acreage should be allocated for fruit and vegetable production.
First of all, there's definitely room for both. Large-scale production of fruits and vegetables in the Corn Belt is probably not an option for most farmers. It just doesn't fit the climate. It's not something that we can do. We can do it at a small scale. The short growing seasons, the weather, the challenges of winter.
Globally, most countries that subsidize crops do so in the form of input support, like providing fertilizer, followed by lump sum payments. The US could follow that example, but US farms have vastly different needs.
I think the difficulty.
I'm not sure what this guy's going to say, but just wanted to call out that this is also an interesting case or an example that they chose to give. This individual keeps kind of advocating for things, but advocating for things unless it negatively impacts him. So he's been kind of highlighting like, yeah, maybe charge more or give less subsidies to big farms, unless you mean a farm of my size. Don't do that. And then it's maybe you could force people to start using portions of their farm to grow fruits and vegetables, but not me. And so I've just found it interesting the examples they chose to use for this video to kind of cover farms and what is being grown, as the individuals they're using for these examples are almost like counterproductive to the case that I think they're trying to make.
Nobody farms exactly the same, and we're not all growing the same crops, and we're dealing with different weather patterns and climate.
The USDA announced an additional $72.9 million in grant funding for specialty crops in 2023 to help make these crops competitive in new markets, and said more assistance could show up in the next Farm Bill.
If you look at the totality of what's being done here, I think you'll see that there's a significant investment that we've made in specialty crop production.
Other solutions include boosting demand for fresh fruits and vegetables in the US and finding new markets for commodities overseas.
Trade is super important. Decreased demand leads to farmers maybe needing more of those financial resources in a farm bill or somewhere else. So we want to be profitable with the market.
Farmers are efficient, and there's hope on the horizon. Vegetable production was up 8% in 2023 compared to 2022, while fruit production was up 1.3%. With less risks and more incentives, producers might grow more specialty crops.
Once you've acquired and you've created a nice business, it should go multi-generations. It shouldn't have to stop because costs got so high we had to sell it. If you're a crappy farmer, well, that's a whole nother story. We're up for the challenge to see if we can make it last.
Well, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.